Merhaba arkadaşlar, konferansımızın son bildirgesini saymazsak son oturumuna gelmiş bulunuyoruz. Hepinize merhaba. Önce bugün Talat Oruç arkadaşımızın doğum günüymüş. Doğum günü bugüne rastlayan başkaları da olabilir aranızda. Önceden haberimiz olsaydı bir jest yapardık, hasta hazırlardık ama son anda haberimiz oldu. Bu duyuru kendi talebi değildir, onu da söylemiş olayım. Onun şartında bugüne rastlayan arkadaşımızın doğum günlerini kutluyor, nice yıllara diyoruz. Sevgili arkadaşlar, sunum yapacak dostlara, yoldaşlarımıza söz vermeden önce kolaylaştırıcılık sınırlarını fazla zorlamadan konferansın şu ana kadarki seyri ve akışı çerçevesinde bazı hususlara dikkat çekmek, bazı değinmelerde bulunmak istiyorum. Şimdi dün bazı öneriler geldi. Ege'nin iki yakasının buluşması gibi ya da nükleer karşıtı platformların müşterek bir toplantısı ve buluşması gibi ya da Ege Cep'ten Halim arkadaşımız sadece ekolojik mücadeleler birbirinden kopuk ve yalıtık değil, aynı zamanda çeşitli ekolojik oluşumlar ve örgütlenmeler de aynı hali yaşıyor. Dolayısıyla bu hali aşacak bir tür haberleşme, bilgilenme, deneyim paylaşım ağı kurmamız lazım şeklinde bir teklifte bulundu. Şunu demek istiyorum. Tabii ki bir konferans yaptık, her şey değişti, olmayacak. Ama herhalde konferansın bazı çıktılarının olması gerekir. Bunun sonrasında Türkiye'deki ekolojik mücadele dinamiklerinin, oluşumlarının deneyim paylaşımı, dayanışması, ilişkilenmesi ve bunun uluslararası bağlantılarını kurması bakımından sanırım bazı ilerletici adımlar, abartmayan ilerletici adımlar atmamız gerekecektir. Şimdi şu ana kadar sunum yapan arkadaşlar bazı ortak sorunlara ve sıkıntılara değindiler. Her mücadele kendi başına önemli olsa da, biricik olsa da, özgünlüğü bulunsa da bazı ortak sıkıntılardan söz ettik. Örneğin az önce Brezilya'dan konuşan arkadaşımız da bu sıkıntılardan bazılarına değindi. Örneğin istihdam meselesi. Bunun yarattığı baskı. Dolayısıyla bir süre sonra herhangi bir alandaki mücadele dinamiğiyle işe alınanlar arasında, işçiler arasında doğan gerilim. Ve belli ki bu birçok yerde karşımıza çıkıyor ve bir sorun olarak önümüzde duruyor. Yani bunu nasıl aşacağımız konusunda da ya da aşma örnekleri varsa deneyim paylaşımına kesinlikle ihtiyacımız var. Örneğin şirketlerin, devlet bürokrasisinin herhangi bir yerdeki ekolojik tepkiyi, orada oluşmuş mücadele dinamiğini parçalamak, kemirmek için başvurduğu yöntemler, rüşvetler, vaatler ya da çeşitli başka ayartıcı girişimler. Bu da bir sorun olarak önümüzde duruyor. Çarpıcı örneği dün Ali Halil vermişti. Efendim Çukuru meselesi. Kala kala bir kişi kaldı diye ifade etmişti. hepiniz duymuşsunuz o sırada salonda olanlar. Örneğin genel olarak böyle tabii ama özellikle tek adam rejimi altında, yeni rejim inşası koşullarında kendi içinde belirli bir önemi olmakla beraber hukuksal mücadelenin kısıtları ve çıkmazları konusuna değinildi. Dolayısıyla fiili mücadelelerle güçle desteklenmediği müddetçe hukukun sınırlarına işaret edildi. Örneğin çeşitli mücadelelerin birbirinden yalıtık kalması, yahut bazı mücadelelerin yeterince yerel dinamiklere dayanmadan, mesela İçirmak platformu adına konuşan arkadaşımız buna işaret etti. Esas olarak İstanbul'un ittirmesiyle biliyor bu İçirmak platformunun işleri. Hiç yerel tabanı yok anlamında söylemedi ama gene Kaz Dağları'nda da benzer bir durumun olduğunu esasen ifade edebiliriz. Yani kısacası bu ortak sorun ve sıkıntılara çözümler üretmemiz gerekir. Bugün ekolojik sorunların, bunların açığa çıkış ve tezahür biçimlerinin bir kataloğunu çıkarsak, bence neredeyse sınırsız bir çeşitliğe erişiriz. Sermaye vantuzlarını toplumsal yaşamın ve doğanın her alanına, her hücresine uzattıkça tabii ki ekolojik sorunlarla ara sıra karşılaştığımız meseleler olmaktan çıkıyor. Süregel, müzmin, her gün, her alanda yeniden büyüyen sorunlar halini alıyorlar. Dolayısıyla bizim mücadelemizin artık ayrılmaz bir bileşeni durumundalar. Türlü tezahürleri, tek bir biçimi yok bunun. Fakat tabii çeşitli iç içe geçme biçimleri de oluyor. Örneğin gene Brezilya sunumundan gördüğümüz üzere esasen ki başka Latin Amerika örneklerden de biliyoruz. Buradaki ekolojik dirençler yer yer yerli halkların tanınma, kendini ifade etme talebi ve arayışlarıyla iç içe ve müşterek haklarını savunma talepleriyle iç içe geçebiliyor. Yani bu mücadeleler çok çeşitli biçimlere bürünebiliyor. Fakat şu anda görünen odur ki bütün bu çeşitlilik içerisinde, saymakla bitmez ekolojik sorun çeşitliliği içerisinde iklim krizi en ön cephe olarak, en yaygın, en küresel mesele olarak ya da insanlığın ve biyosferin geleceğini yakın bir tehdit olarak ilgilendiren bir sorun olarak öne çıkmış gibi gözüküyor. Bunu hafife alamayız. Çünkü dönüp baktığımızda hani dün Türk Tabipler Birliği'nden arkadaşımız arka planını anlattı, küresel sözleşmeler, hangi adımlar atıldı, hangi konferanslar yapıldı ve nihayet işte Paris İklim Sözleşmesi, öncesinde Kyoto, hepiniz haberdarsınızdır. Trump yönetimi şeyler çekiliyor. Yani bizim yetersiz bulduğumuz, son derece yetersiz bulduğumuz Paris İklim Sözleşmesi'nden çekiliyor. Bolsonaro Brezilya'sı aynı doğrultuda hazırlık yapıyor. Çekilme lafları etmeye başladı. Ülkeler taahhüt ettikleri limitlere uymuyorlar. Türkiye dahil olmak üzere hala bu anlaşmayı da imzalamamış ülkeler bulunmaktadır. Dolayısıyla yani yetersiz bulduğumuz çerçeve dahi kemirilmektedir. Durumun ciddiyetini dün Türk Tabipler Birliği'nden arkadaşımız anlattı. Bu 1,5 derece, 2 derece, yarım derecenin ne kadar önemli olduğu konusunu dün Türk Tabipler Birliği'nden arkadaşımız anlattı. Bu öyle bir mücadele ki eğer yakın tehditse şöyle diyemeyiz. Biz tamam yani bir yandan bunu sosyalizm mücadelesinin bir veçesi olarak ele alırken ekolojik mücadele eksenli reformlar meselesini, bu tehdidi geciktirecek ve savuşturacak adımlar meselesini, devletlerin, hükümetlerin bu açıdan baskı altına alınma meselesini kesinlikle hafife alamayız. Çünkü daha şimdiden bırakınız önleyici adımları, artık bir iklim krizini veri kabul edip bundan faydalanmayı uman güçler var. Trump o malum zaten bir kış günü kalktı, dedi ki her taraf buz kesmiş. Ne bir küresel ısınma falan yok, her taraf buz kesmiş. Yani onun küresel ısınma kavrayışı böyle. Ardından Grönland'da kaybım dedi. Sebepsiz değil, çünkü buzullar eriyecek. O yüzden orası faydalanabilir bir alan. Rusya'nın bugün Kuzey Kutup'taki buzulların erimesine göre hesaplar yaptığını, Asya-Afrika ticaretinin Kuzey Buz Denizi'nden geçirmek üzere hazırlık halinde olduğunu biliyor. Bunlar iklim krizinden faydalanıcı yaklaşımlar. Önlemeyi bir kenara bırakalım. Artık ya olacak, başımıza gelecek diye kabullendiler ve bundan çıkarılma. Bunu da rekabetin bir konusu haline getirme yaklaşım. Elbette ki doğrudur. Almanya'dan arkadaşlarımız değindiler. İklim krizi derken biz aynı zamanda iklim adaleti biliriz. Genel olarak ekolojik krizden söz ederken ya bütün insanlık etkileniyor. Elbette doğrudur. Hiç kimse bunun sonuçlarından kaçamaz ama herkes aynı etkileniyor. Burada da çok derin eşitsizlikler olduğunu görmemiz lazım. Bu çerçevede bir ekoemperyalizmden de söz edebileceğimizin altını çizmemiz lazım. Kirli sanayiler başka ülkelere var. Türkiye örneğimizdir işte. Yeni yapım sanayi burada. Çimento sanayi burada. Türkiye en fazla atık satın alan ülkelerden biri haline gelmeye başladı. Bunun bir ekoemperyalizm olduğunun altını çizmemiz gerekiyor. Şimdi dünkü oturumlar boyunca arkadaşlar sık sık neredeyse salonda sık tekrarlandı ve salonda genel bir kabul haline geldi. Ekolojik mücadele, politik bir mücadele. Zaten şeyimiz de öyle. Üst başlığımızda öyle. Ekoloji politik diyoruz. Şimdi doğru, biz aynı zamanda şunun kavgasını veriyoruz her yerde. Özel olan politiktir diyoruz. Ekonomik alan, siyasal alan ayrımını, kapitalizmin üzerine yaslandığı ikilikleri, özel kamusalı vesaire bu ayrımları aşmak istiyoruz. Özel olan politikse bunun kavgasını veriyoruz işte. Bir derecelendirme bakımından söylemiyorum. Ekolojik olan da haydi politiktir. Herhangi bir somut mücadelenin, belirli bir mücadelenin kendi seyri içerisinde politikleşmesinden bağımsız olarak söylüyorum bunu. Ve fakat bu konferansın başlığının ima ettiği şey bundan ibaret değil. Yani ekolojik olan bu manada politik, sadece bu kısım içerisinde anlamayalım. Bu başlığın başka bir manası. Marx'ın başyapıtının üst başlığını hepiniz hatırlıyorsunuzdur. Kapitalizm. Ekonomik politiğin eleştirisi. Esasen o başyapıtta da ekonomik politiğin eleştirisinin ekolojik imaları ve çevreleri de vardır. Daha meta tahlilinde bu vardır. Kurların değeri, değişim değeri çelişkisi tahlilinde bu vardır. Ama başlığımız demektedir ki şimdi kapitalizm eleştirisi, sermaye eleştirisi, burjuva çağı eleştirisi bir ve aynı anda ekolojik politik bir eleştiri olmak zorundadır. Ki yeni kuracağımız toplumu da bu eleştiri koşullasın. Dolayısıyla bu genişlik içerisinde almamız gerekiyor. Bu ekolojik politik başlığı. Sık bir tanesi, birçok arkadaşımız vurguladı. Hayvan haklarına değinildi ve sık tekrarlandı bir insan merkezcilik eleştirisi. İzninizle bunun üzerinde biraz durmak istiyorum. Buradaki paradoksa dikkatinizi çekeceğim. Biz konuşuyoruz insan merkezcilik kanununda. Biz kim? Homo sapiens, insan. Biz konuşuyoruz. Paradoks budur. Şimdi burada öz düşünümsellik bu önemli tabii. Yani kendi üzerimizde ve kendi varoluş koşullarımız hakkında ve doğa üzerinde düşünmeye başlıyoruz. Ancak bunu açmamın sebebi şudur arkadaşlar. Şimdi diyelim ki haklar konuşuyoruz. Hayvanlar, kediler kendi hakları hakkında slogan atmıyorlar. Bu hakları biz konuyoruz. Eğer bir ekolojik toplum inşa edeceksek, bunun toplumsal sözleşmesinin temelinde bu sözleşmeyi koşullayacak bir etik olacaksa, bir etik de inşa edeceksek, bu etiği de biz inşa edeceğiz. Yani demek istiyorum ki böyle kolay insan merkezcilik diye geçmeyelim. Bu esasen yükümüzü hafifletmiyor, ağırlaştırıyor. Yani kendi kendimize telkinde bulunuyoruz. Kendin, doğa ve varoluş koşullarının hakkında yeniden. Ve sen nesin? Nesine bir cevabımız var. Benim cevabım şudur. İnsan doğanın bilincidir. Doğanın kendi üzerinde düşünme kapasitesi ve potansiyelidir. Bu insan merkezli eleştirisinin paradoksuna dikkatinizi çekmek istiyorum. Yani bu eleştiri biz yapıyoruz. Sınıftan birileri yapmıyor. Bu biraz şuna da benziyor. Diyelim ki biz doğrular Avrupa merkezlilik eleştirisi yaptık. Dıştan yapmış gibi oluyoruz. Avrupa'nın dışından yapmış. Ama Avrupalı yapınca bu başka bir mana kazanıyor. Avrupa'nın içinden yapıyor. Yani daha öz düşünsel bir süreç onun için. Şimdi fakat biz ekolojik olan politiktir, ekolojik mücadele politiktir deyip burada kalamayız. Bence. Tam şeyimizin başlığına geçiş yapmak zorundayız. Oturumumuzun başlığına. Ekolojik mücadelenin toplumsal ve sınıfsal boyutları. Politiktir dediğimiz andan itibaren evet diyoruz. Bu toplumsal ve sınıfsal bir meseledir. Bu kriz, ekolojik kriz, toplumun belli bir örgütleniş tarzıyla, belli ve tarihsel bir örgütleniş tarzıyla, üretimin, tüketimin, dolaşımın belli bir örgütleniş tarzıyla yakından bağlantılıdır. İnsan-insan ilişkileriyle insan-doğa ilişkileri birbirini karşılıklı olarak koşullar. Birini değiştirmeksizin diğerini değiştiremezsiniz. İkisini bir ve aynı anda yapmak durumundasınız. İnsan-insan ilişkilerini değiştirecekseniz, insan-doğa ilişkilerinde radikal bir biçimde dönüşme ulaşacaksınız. Peki, tek bir kalıba sığdırmak istemem ama günümüzün insan ilişkilerinin ana belirleyeni nedir? Kanaatimce günümüzün insan ilişkilerinin ana belirleyeni sermayedir. Marx'ın meşhur sözünü hatırlayalım. Sermaye bir şey değildir. Bir toplumsal ilişkidir. Sermaye bugün gündelik hayatımızda bütün toplumsal ilişkilerimizi koşullayan bir ilişki tarzı. O halde bu ilişki tarzını değiştireceğiz. Ama bir ve aynı anda, aynı zamanda insan-doğa ilişkilerinde dönüşüme ulaşacağız. Burjuva çağın başlangıcında da böyle oldu. Bir ve aynı anda insan ilişkileri, insan-doğa ilişkileri dönüştürüldü. Kartezyen doğa anlayışı radikal bir kopuştur. Doğa manadan arındırıldı. Munzur platformu adına dün konuşan arkadaşımız dedi ki, Munzur bizim için kutsaldır. Şimdi bu manalı doğadır, mana yüklenmiş doğadır. Kapitalizm böyle doğayı kabul etmez. Dedi ki her tarafta ziyaretlerimiz var, kutsaldır onlar. Kutsallıkları aldırmaz. O eski toplumun alışkanlıklarıdır ve insan-doğa ilişkilerine getirdiği düzenler ve kısıtlamalardır. Eski toplumlar tamamen masumdur demek istemiyorum. Kesinlikle öyle anlaşılmasın. Ama sermaye çağıyla beraber bu kısıtlardan da kurtulmuş oldu. Doğa, insan etkinliğinin, insan müdahalesinin pasif, edilgen bir sahnesi, bir ham madde deposu, bir kaynak olarak algılandı. Bu ikiliyi elbette aşmamız gerekiyor. Ancak ve lakin bu ikiliyi aşarken tek bir doğa var, bir evrim yaşanmadı. Her şeyi o bir doğa içerisinde eritebiliriz diye bakamayız bence. İlkin Batı Marksizminin gündemimize soktuğu birinci doğa, ikinci doğa ayrımı var. Bu ayrımı gerçek kabul etmeliyiz. Eninde sonunda evrim oldu ve eğer Homo sapiens bir bilinçli varlık olarak temayül ettiyse, eğer bir ilk günah varsa, bu günahı da doğa işledi. Onu görelim. Biz ikinci doğayı tasfiye edemeyiz. Artık toplumsal evrimin sosyal evrim diye bir boyutu var. Biz birinci doğayla ikinci doğa arasındaki diyalektiği ve ilişkiyi doğru kurmaya odaklanmak durumundayız diye düşünüyorum. Dün belki dikkatlerden kaçmıştır. Hem Hasankeyf adına hem Mezopotamya Ekoloji hareketi adına sunumlar oldu. Özellikle Mezopotamya Ekoloji hareketinden arkadaşımız kendilerinin farklı bir paradigmayı öne sürdüklerini ve temsil ettiklerini anlattı bize. Tarihin derinliklerinden kalkarak bir uygarlık eleştirisi yaptı. Esasen sadece Sümerlerden başlayarak, rahip devletlerinden başlayarak, tapınaklardan başlayarak, hiyerarşiden, devletten, merkezleşmeden başlayarak ekolojik sorunların kökenlerine inmemiz gerektiğini ve bir uygarlık eleştirisi yaptı. Onun adına konuşmak istemem. Bu uygarlık eleştirisi bir ne diyelim, uygarlık karşıtlığı olarak anlaşılmasın. Paradigmayı bilenler biliyor. Orada denmektedir ki uygarlık içerisinde hep başka varyantlar, hep başka olasılıklar, hep başka alternatifler vardı. Öyle sadece saklı potansiyel olarak değil, bunların mücadelesi de vardı. Ama bu bildiğimiz uygarlık kazandı. Bu sınıflı uygarlık kazandı buraya gelinceye kadar. Dolayısıyla biz bu arkadaşlar buna demokratik uygarlık çizgisi diyorlar. Tıpkı modernite eleştirisi yaparken bir demokratik modernlik içerisinde de böyle kulvarların ve alternatiflerin bulunduklarını iddia ettikleri gibi. Ben yani şunu söylemekle yetineceğim. Bu konularda yeterince eleştirel diyalog içerisinde değiliz. Dolayısıyla yani birçok yerde sözlükçe söylüyorum. Herkesi bu paradigmayla da eleştirel diyaloğa davet ediyorum. Birazcık uzattım, evet. Burada noktalayacağım, resmiyeceğim. Son olarak toplumsallık derken bir yaklaşımı kesinlikle dışlamamız lazım. Şöyle bir yaklaşım var. Şimdi jeolojik dönemler yeniden tasnif ediliyor. İçinde bulunduğumuz bu ekolojik krizin keskinleştiği döneme antroposen dönem. İnsanın doğaya müdahalesinin ve doğa üzerindeki etkinliğinin taban yaptığı bir dönemi karakterize etmesi anlamında antroposen dönem deniyor. O zaman şöyle oluyor. Bütün bu olup bitenlerden insan etkinliği sorumlu. Biz böyle bir toplumsallığı kastetmemeliyiz bence. Demin söyledim. Toplumun belli bir örgütlenme tarzı, belli bir toplumsal ilişki tarzı bundan sorumludur. Bir sınıf bundan sorumludur. Sermaye sorumludur. Faili gizleyemeyiz. Gizemli hale getiremeyiz. Bu konuda fail bellidir. Sınıfsallık derken de biz asla kaba bir sınıf indirgemeyi kastetmiyoruz. Sınıf mücadelesi kavramının kapsamını genişletmemiz gerekiyor. Sadece emek sermaye ilişkisi içerisinden, ücretli emek ilişkisi içerisinden değil, çok farklı kalkış noktalarından sermayenin tahakkümüne karşı direnen, onu sınırlandırmaya çalışan, güçsüzleştirmeye karşı direnen kent hakkı mücadelesi de yani. Kısacası sermaye ile sorunu olan herkes esasen geniş manada bir sınıf mücadelesi veriyor. Sınıf mücadelesinde bu genişlik içerisinde yorumlamamız gerekiyor. Sunumcu arkadaşlarımız kusura bakmasınlar, bunları söylemek zorundayım. Çünkü sözü onlara bırakacağım. Bendeki sıralamaya göre ilk söz Patrick Bond'un. Buyurun.
If okay, I will stand here. So, in the big screen, F5. Could you make a big screen? The big screen. Okay. So in South Africa, has everybody got interpretations? Thank you for the great translation. Thank you. We have a saying at the beginning, Amandla, which means power, Aweto to the people. And since South Africa and Turkey are in a sub-imperialist, with Brazil a sub-imperialist location, Camilla spoke of the super exploitation. You saw in that amazing film, The Massacre. Did you remember this massacre of the mine workers from Longmen? And that was a massacre because the workers were super exploited. They demanded higher wages, about 900 euros equivalent per month. But it was also against extractivism, against the destruction of nature in the search for platinum. And you saw immediately after that it was the women behind the men who could make them sufficiently strong in the social reproduction of labor that they continued to fight. And I think it's that linkage that makes us in South Africa so respectful of what you do in this conference and in all of the sites of struggle. I will pick up from Kenan's beautiful introduction, the first part to amplify in the battle over ideas, the weakness of sustainable development, the dominance but the limits of climate action, the rising ideology of climate justice, but the necessity for an ecofeminist socialist liberation within our political ideology. We have to, I will stress as Kenan did, we have to put as an overall priority to link the scattered movements, as he said, with this as a central objective, bringing CO2 equivalent parts per million in our atmosphere, down from about 415 to 350. And when we look at who is doing this, Turkey is always very central because you have more than 100 profound struggles for environmental justice that are on our map, the EJ Atlas. Maybe comrades are familiar with Begum and her team at Bogazici University, who have worked very hard with many of you as activists in documenting for the rest of the world. To make these links, Kenan, to take the scattered, fragmented, atomistic struggles and bring them closer together. These are about 100 that are listed in our EJ Atlas, but maybe there are more that need to be added. So we would invite you, ejatlas.org, so that Turkey continues to be the cutting edge for environmental justice struggle. And organizations that are part of this can link up more and more with our movements around the world. If we look in the next 15 minutes at the climate movements, we have Blockadia as the most obvious way that our comrades in different sites where there are fossil fuels in extraction, in transport, in refining, in combustion, are at least saying, leave the coal in the hole, leave the oil in the soil, leave the tar sands under the land, leave the shale grass under the grass. The moment in September 20, also September 27, where this movement of blockadia at the base found a world expression at the probably most coordinated level was the climate strike. So let's think about what the ideologies that bring 4 million on September 20, another 2 million on September 27, not only together for the one moment, but for intensifying these struggles. Extinction Rebellion has got the highest profile. They're in the media capital of London, and they're doing a fine job of disrupting business as usual. The police have been trying to ban them, not successfully. Greta Thunberg's movement that began just over a year ago has become so large so quickly for the student strike. And as she's networked, especially in the most difficult, backward country for doing this work, where they elected a president, Kenan said, a climate denialist. It's moving very quickly, even with the Capitol Hill, the US Congress's Sunrise Movement is showing, and with the Green New Deal we'll come back to. In South Africa, some of these movements have begun to spark in Cape Town. This was September 20 in Durban. In Johannesburg, where I live, in Cape Town again, food sovereignty, fisher folk, the youth. So this is the critical question. As the youth begin to identify more with a deeper critique, as they seek generational justice, it requires, I think, what we found in Aachen in Germany in June. You already had yesterday discussions of Humbacher, but it was beautiful to see the Ende Gelände after school children in Aachen go and disrupt in the nearby coal fields, taking over the plant for at least that day at some cost. And here's where the ideology now begins to become clearer. The question of today coal, tomorrow capitalism, where I think we all want to go with this ideological exploration. There is something in between that's a problem. The United Nations. UN, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, is the framework within which much climate politics is unfolding. And the problem is the United Nations did not agree on sufficient climate change emissions cuts. It would be at this point 3 degrees, but probably more if they aren't able to make the cuts. The US has dropped out, as Kenan said, Brazil likely. It's non-binding. That's the crucial difference between the older deal, Kyoto. There's no enforcement. Donald Trump walks out, no penalty, no carbon tax, no sanctions. Also, the liabilities of the polluters, the biggest companies in the world, the biggest governments, is simply erased because the United States delegate from the State Department, Todd Stern, refused to allow the climate debt to be in the Paris Climate Agreement. Carbon trading, the privatization of the air, is back on the agenda. It's making a comeback in Europe after 10 years. I think Sonia will raise this. Intellectual property over the desperately needed technology to give us renewable energy and all of the other innovations to cut emissions, still controlled through the World Trade Organization and the big Western governments, still controlled, and big profits are required, and it's therefore too expensive. Military, shipping, airlines, not included in Paris. So the main winners, the United States, Europe, and the sub-imperial powers, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they were part and parcel of agreeing that there's a sort of a sub-imperial alliance on climate. There's one word that the greatest climate scientist uses to explain Paris. The word is bullshit. And the reason is simple. These are capitalist states whose delegates go to represent their biggest industrial and fossil fuel emitters. So they simply are unable, without our throwing them out of power, to use this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to actually make the kinds of cuts and to open up a climate justice politics that we desperately need. And as I say, it's not simply Western imperialism. I think we do have a problem with a layer, and Erdogan would like to be at a table like that, wouldn't he? But here you see a league of super polluters, as 350.org's leader, who agreed when they initially broke the binding constraints and the penalties in Copenhagen. And it was those five guys who set up the Copenhagen Accord. And although Julian Assange is in prison in London, hey, we really thank him and Chelsea Manning for liberating the information about how the State Department bullied and bribed to get the Copenhagen Accord as the main world political agenda for climate policy. So where does that take us in terms of ideologies and the direction towards eco-feminist socialism? Normally we would go through all of these kinds of movements and look for their principles, their analyses, their strategies, their tactics, the alliances. We don't have too much time, so let's just look at some of the deep principles and some of the origins. Yes, in Marx and Das Kapital and the deep critique of the laws of accumulation, of class struggle and social reproduction. I think Luxemburg in her work on imperialism opened this up so well by looking at capitalist and the non-capitalist relations, the super-exploitation entailed, especially when there are free gifts of nature and of women's work in social reproduction. And she thought of this battle that capital wages against every historical form of natural economy that it encounters. The most important is, of course, the land, its hidden mineral resource, its meadows, woods, and water. And capital plans the systemic destruction and annihilation of these non-capitalist processes. That is the basis for a theory of imperialism, one that our greatest African political economist, Samir Amin, who died last year, but brought forward the Luxemburgist perspective, especially in his last years in relation to nature. He felt historical Marxisms had largely passed an eraser over the analyses and taken the point of the bourgeoisie, a rational point of view in regard to the exploitation of natural resources. So if we start at this site of Marxist, the metabolic rift and the ways in which, especially in a debate, say, with the degrowth, which doesn't necessarily see the capitalist mode of production, but simply growth as the problem. I think John Bellamy Foster has given us such great work in Monthly Review to think through the transition, not just from growth-based accumulation, but to eco-socialism. A feminist, Ariel Saleh, has talked through various kinds of debts and reparations required, including the embodied debt to women, family caregivers, along with side debt to nature. If those of you interested in race and environment want to see one of the great set of books, it's from Robert Bullard, who identified correlations of racism with pollution. Jean Martinez Allier in Barcelona with the eJobs project, thinking through the environmentalism of the poor. We've had, in other words, some amazing innovations that bring together not simply individual sectors, but what I think can be, as Martinez Allier is looking for from the South, much bigger philosophies, such as the demands that come from the Andes, especially Acción Ecológica, an eco-feminist socialist group to leave fossil fuels, with Sumac Kose, Buen Vivir, and the rights of nature being advanced from that side. The ecological debt, the environmental liabilities, and ecologically unequal exchange. So this is one of the core new arguments about imperialism, right? That the resource extraction, the depletion of the South's resources is central, and it's often forgotten in most of the standard political economy works, which abstract away from these free gifts of nature, the campesina being one of these. Now, with Donald Trump, as Kenan said, advancing a pure denialist perspective, the concept of global warming warming created by and for the Chinese, right? To make US manufacturing non-competitive. So you have an insane level of nihilism. But it's not that unusual if we think back in Johannesburg to 2002, where we understood the corporate agenda. It begins with the nihilism and divide and conquer, and the division between those struggling for social justice and environmentalists. A very strong division, which we have to come back to, especially with labor and the quandaries of the Green New Deal and the just transition. So when we found sustainable development at the World Summit for Sustainable Development in Johannesburg, it was a Trojan horse for a new modernizing capitalism that wanted to take principles of technological fixes and market mechanisms. So we could go through those if you want false solutions, but I think carbon trading is an exemplar, because it is to say you can pay for the right to pollute. And that was, in a sense, the obvious moment where a man like this, although this is about 11 years earlier, preparing for the first Rio conference, Larry Summers wrote a memo where he says the economic logic behind dumping a load of toxic waste in the lowest wage country is impeccable, and we should face up to that. Africa is vastly underpolluted. This is a memo in the chief economist's office of the World Bank to prepare the bank for the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. That logic never went away. I think a good response was from the environment minister, Jose Luxemburg, from Brazil. He said, "Your thoughts are a concrete example of the unbelievable alienation, reductionist thinking, social ruthlessness, and the arrogant ignorance of many conventional economists concerning the nature of the world we live in. If the World Bank keeps you as vice president, it will lose all credibility." Yes, Larry Summers stayed as World Bank vice president and chief economist, but then he was promoted to deputy finance minister and then finance minister in the United States. He became president of Harvard. He was fired for sexism, and then Barack Obama's economic czar. And Luxemburger was fired for saying this. So this is the power relations that we're up against, just in the realm of ideas. What that led to over the subsequent period was climate joining in the environmental justice rise and networking. I think the most profound point for defining climate justice, here I don't mean the way it's being co-opted by many today, but I mean the origins that were in Cochabamba, Bolivia in April 2010. Not time to go through each of the points, but you can see they include all of the kind of core features of what we think of as the politics that celebrate the indigenous, that reflect on the extreme exploitation associated with North-South power relations, the need to get rid of the consumption, the carbon markets, and to change northern consumption norms. Now, one feature that's become much more difficult since then, you know better than anyone, given the droughts in Syria that preceded 2011's uprising, is climate refugees. So I think a new feature for climate justice has got to be on the rights of people who have been now victimized once by climate change and now increasingly by the border and repression and xenophobia. We've seen this, as I'll show you, in our own country, South Africa, where we cause so much climate change through our electricity production by coal-fired power plants. But when the sisters and brothers who were victims of it in Mozambique and Zimbabwe and Malawi cross our border, we have a very serious problem of xenophobia that comes from a working class under terrible stress. So struggling to make xenophobia part and parcel of climate justice and vice versa is going to be more and more critical. To get now to this ideological development from Acción Ecológica, it's in Quito, it's an office of all women, and they're such strong eco-feminist socialists. So they've chosen a place as an example of the sorts of struggles that have global manifestations and are not just micro campaigns, but exemplary struggle. This is Yasuni in the Amazon. It's the most biodiverse hotspot in the world. And underneath there, beautiful Amazonian forest. Unfortunately, it's about 850 million barrels of oil, $10 billion. So their campaign has been to leave it underground and to demand a climate debt from the north to give the Ecuadorian government the revenues it would otherwise have received, $3.5 billion. And again, the indigenous people, Quechua, who many in that area have not had any contact with the rest of the world, and this solidaristic, especially youth-led Yasunidos, the activists, tried very hard. They didn't win in their struggle. We've been trying to think, particularly because of our own African sites of climate vulnerability, how to bring these climate debt struggles. Just to very quickly show you, we've had massive droughts. Cape Town, the second biggest city, nearly ran out of water, day zero. Many other smaller cities are. The drought is continuing in many parts of the country, but we also have floods. This one in April, on Easter Monday, killed 71 people. It was a rain bomb of 168 millimeters in 24 hours. And the people who died were, just as Kenan said, you can do not just a class, a race, a gender analysis. It was poor black women and children who suffered. There are some millionaires who lost their houses, but they survived. But the effect in a place like Durban, extremely unequal city, about the 5th most unequal in the world, was obvious. The point being that the compensation for these losses, 71 lives, priceless, we can't compensate. But it was about 15% delivered by the national aid agencies and housing agencies. But it was even worse just north at the same time. You might have heard 2 cyclones hit Mozambique. And it's very strange, their pattern, because the heat in the Agulhas current in the Mozambique Channel, offshore Mozambique, between Mozambique and Madagascar, was very high. It was 2 degrees higher. So this storm, Cyclone Idai, went in and then came out, got more heat, energy, and water, and actually dumped on the 3rd largest city. So 90% was destroyed on March 14 to 18, March 4 to 18. And more than 1,000 people died there, and also inland in Zimbabwe, central Mozambique, this is Zimbabwe, and even as far north as Malawi. So a massive cyclone followed 6 weeks later by another one that was even more powerful, but didn't hit as heavily concentrated areas. And at the same time, terrible droughts in Mozambique. Again, my point, not only that yet another case of a climate destruction, but the lack of northern funding to pay for the damage the north did meant only 25% financial compensation was available. This leads to the kinds of ideological debates you're having here. We had the same kind of meeting in Johannesburg in March to try to come to grips with how to put the coalitions of community, environmentalists, women, youth, and especially labor together. We do have a strong socialist labor movement. This Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party began this year, did very badly, but it will grow. But the ideology, even though on the ground it's difficult to compel, is exemplified by the metal workers leader, Irvin Jim, who's calling for socially owned renewables, so a decommodification process and a state and a nationalized politics. I'm hoping that will move from the national labor down to the roots, because we have lots of struggles against fossil fuels across South Africa. And just to give you a sense in some of the coal fields of how these contradictions look between labor, communities, environment, it may be good to have excellent rhetoric at the national level, but at the base, you still have workers, and this is a terrible site, Fuyeni, in northern KwaZulu-Natal, right next to the oldest game park in Africa, where men are really demanding that the coal mine expand, and the women are the ones saying, no, the more you expand the coal mine, the more we have broken houses because of blasting, the more our land is taken from us, the more our water systems are polluted, the more our air is full of dust and we can't grow. So it's a very important site, and I'll just give you one of your set of sisters in this struggle to try to stop this kind of mining. Also, by the way, with conservationists trying to stop poaching. But the group called Women in Mining would be one if some of you comrades are looking for the linkages across Africa that's done exceptionally well to develop an eco-feminist, and I think they would say openly, socialist approach to fighting mining, fighting extractivism. There is a bigger project in South Africa, 1 million climate jobs, that just transition. But I'll close with thinking about how much more we must do to get into every area capitalism has invaded to get this linkage between the critique and all of the activism on the ground. I used a book from 2014, This Changes Everything. I would expect if Turkish translation is there, because what Naomi Klein does is really help us think through the variety of ways that climate really changes everything, from not just energy and transport, where we mostly work, but the urban form, your Gezi Park struggle, your housing and services, your agriculture and food, the production, consumption, disposal, health, education, arts, social policy, and social and private space campaigns. So I think that's one of the sites where her new book helps to bring us up to date with struggles in the most difficult place where until recently you couldn't even say the word socialism. If you comrades are interested in connecting more back to my site, I would be happy to send you all of our, English books. But I do thank you very much, comrades. Amandla, where to?
Sunumu, bilgilendirmeleri ve aydınlatmaları için bu konuda çok teşekkürler. Esasen başlangıçta söylemeyi unuttum. Kendisi Güney Afrika'dan. Türkiye ilgisi bakımından da teşekkür ederiz kendisine. Güney Afrika öteden beri, esasen apartheid karşıtı mücadeleden beri Türkiye'nin solcularının, devrimcilerin, komünistlerinin sürekli bir ilgi alanı oraya geldi. Oradaki deneyimlerden sürekli olarak yararlanmak istiyoruz. Tabii apartheid sonrası ya da ırkçı rejimin tasfiyesi sonrasında yaşanan dramatik süreçlerde ilgimizi çekiyor. Tekrar kendisine teşekkür ediyorum. Şimdi bu oturumda tabii ki bir yandan da beklentimiz bakımından söylüyorum. Yani konferans düzenleyenlerin beklentisi bakımından bu oturumu söylüyorum. Aynı zamanda sosyalizmin içi çeşitli ekolojik perspektifleri ve yaklaşımları oluşturmak, birbiriyle eleştirel temasa geçirmek diye bir maksadı da var bu oturumun. Bunu da hatırlatmış oluyorum. Şimdi ikinci sözü Sosyal Def Parti Avusturya'dan Sonya Gres'e.
Teşekkür ederim. I want to thank you very much for the invitation and for the possibility to learn about the developments and the discussions that are taking place in Turkey at the moment. And I think in this room there is no need to give a detailed explanation about the ecological disaster and catastrophe. I think everybody is clear about the different aspects of global warming, pollution of air, soil and water, the dramatic effects in relation to floods and droughts, including the rising of prices for food and the need of millions to flee their homes. All this is familiar, and it's not only familiar to us, but scientists have been pointing to all these since decades. The first time that the negative effects of CO2 onto the atmosphere were mentioned was in 1895, and the first climate summit of the UN took place 40 years ago. And it's quite clear what is necessary and this is the immediately pulling out of energy production from fossils and from nuclear power. But we also know that nothing has been happening in the last decades, although all these is very, very clear. The opposite is that we see a lot of fake declarations. Like some days ago, the OECD has declared that they are supporting the Paris Climate Treaty, which is ridiculous. I mean, the OECD is the oil coming together, companies and countries taking out the oil of the soil, and they plan an extra investment in the next years worth $10 billion, and they expect to keep the part and proportion of fossil energy, although the need for energy is expected to rise, but they want to keep the fossils by 2/3 of this. So this shows how token their support of the climate summit, of course, is. But on the other hand, we see the huge movements, and we have seen it in the video at the beginning, of millions on the world rising up against what's happening. And this gives us a real possibility for a real change of track. You said about Rosa Luxemburg, and there is, of course, a famous quote that everybody in this room knows. Rosa Luxemburg said, there is the chance, there is a question of socialism or barbarism for the question of the future. And it's so dramatic what's happening in relation to the climate and the environment that it's necessary to have dramatic and quick and radical, in the sense of the word, coming to the source of the problem, dramatic solutions. And therefore I want to speak about 2 points. I want to start with 2 points. One is, what is the source of the problem? And the second one, what is the solution? And then I try to link up the A and the B. Many have been saying this before: the source of the problem is the capitalist system. It's not the greed of the one or the other person. It's not that human beings are too stupid, but it's the mechanism, the logic, the way that capitalism is functioning and has been functioning. And it is true that human beings have been exploiting nature before capitalism, but there wasn't qualitative change to the way that this happened and the effects that had in the last 70 years. And this is because in capitalism everything is becoming a commodity. And this is including all parts of nature, including the labor of human beings and the rest of nature. And the competition in capitalism, which is often sold to us as something we are set to benefit from, this competition and the need of making profits every day and every minute, this is the reason for the killing of human beings and the nature. So I think if you look seriously at the problem of the demolition of nature, then it becomes clear that there is no solution within capitalism, and there is no solution which is rooted in the logic of capitalism. And I want to give some examples on this. There is a big debate in the EU going on about the question of carbon tax. There should be a taxation of carbon emissions. So let's for a moment leave aside the social dimension of this, because this would have extreme negative effects for people who rely on, for example, on their car to go to work. But leave aside this. Let's just look if it would work, at the end of the day. So would it reduce carbon emissions in the industry? No, because if companies would be taxed in Europe, then they would just shift the production in other countries where you have lower ecological standards, and therefore carbon emissions would increase. It would actually increase and not be decreased. So there are other options and other discussions in relation to carbon emissions where they say, well, let's tax imports from countries where you have high carbon emissions in the production. And this is actually what parts of the European steel industry are demanding, because because they try to get rid of competition from cheaper countries with this idea. So would this work? No, it would not work. It would not work because the production in the countries where it's already cheaper and less eco-friendly. I mean, the European steel industry is not at all eco-friendly, but they have at least to meet some standards. But it would in the other countries where you have no standards, it would actually mean that it decreased even further. The working conditions would be worse, and the situation for the environment would be worse. So it would not work. But would it mean at least work within Europe? You could say, okay, a problem in the rest of the world, but within Europe, would it work? No, it would not work. Because the problem you have here is the nation state. Every government has one major role to play, and this is to give the best possible framework for its respective capitalists to be competitive on the world market. And this is why all the question of carbon emissions or trade of emissions does not work, because in the countries you have it, you have very generous exceptions. For the big industry, they don't have to pay. It's the normal consumers that have to pay, but not the big industry, because this would be a negative effect on competition. And therefore, there is no possibility to solve it on that line. But then there are others coming up and say, well, let's try to use the mechanisms. Let's be very tricky. Let's try to beat capitalism with its own, ideas, its own weapons, its own systematics. And it is true that a lot of big companies have understood that there is a problem with the environment and that they have to react. But what do they do? Do they really change into eco-friendly production? Well, most of the time they don't do. And where they do it, they again do it on the basis of exploiting people and implementing things without any discussion. And there have been a lot of reports about water or wind energy projects which have been implemented in regions where they do not fit into the regions, where the people have not been asked, where it was, again, an attempt of a big company to make profits, but they don't care at all about nature, they only care about their profits. So I think there is definitely no way to fool capitalism. There is no basis in a joint struggle with capitalists for the future of the planet. And this is because it's in the DNA of capitalism. So the second part is, where do we want to go to? How can we solve the problem? And a lot of people have been speaking here about the need for a change. It's the slogan of the movement, change the system, not the climate. So it is necessary not only to make the one or the other change, but it's necessary to get rid of the capitalist system and replace it by a system which is based on the economy and the society, is based on the needs of the people and democratically run by the people. And that would also mean that all technology which is existing already today, but much more that could be invented in the future, that all these is used for the needs of the people to have decent and proper lives, to improve the living standard of the millions that live in poverty, or billions actually, that live in poverty on the planet. And this would not just mean to produce less, as some argue, we have to, it's too much, we have to produce less. But it would mean to use all the talents and all the ideas that are wasted today because the profit-driven idea of science, the minimizing, the reduction of talents to limit them to what's profitable. If you free this, then you have the possibility to use all these sources for the benefit of humanity. Just imagine if housework, which probably not everybody in this room is doing on a daily basis, but if housework would be not done in every single household, but if washing, cleaning up and cooking would be organized publicly and professional, what would this save in unnecessary waste not only of time, but also of resources. And of course, especially liberate women from very unpleasant work, usually. And in such a society, the future of the planet and a good life for everybody would be not contradiction. A lot of people have been saying here that such another world, an anti-capitalist world, a socialist world, is something to fight for. But then there is the question, how do we get there? It's not only philosophers interpreting the world, but it's a question of how do we get from the problem to the solution. And it's very, very obvious that we cannot rely on any of the governments or the international institutions like the UN or others or the EU to solve the problem for us. But it's the millions that are on the street in these days, the youth, the indigenous people fighting for our future, the people in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, against the big oil companies, the people suffering in Peking, in Mumbai, in Delhi, from the heavy air pollution. All these are struggles, like the majority of the struggles in China that are taking place, hundreds every year, against not only exploitative labor, but also against the devastation of the nation. So the destruction of nature is a problem, as was said, that is affecting everybody on the planet. But it's not equally how the effects are felt. It is a social question, and it is, for sure, it is a class question. It's a class question because it's the working class that feels it heaviest, but it's also a class question because only the working class has the power in the world to solve the problem and to change the society in a way that is necessary. The question of environment is not new to the workers' movement. Marx and Engels, in their writings, have been dealing actually quite a lot with the question of sustainability and the metabolic rift, which means the fact that capitalism is destroying the sensitive balance between human beings and nature. They have been dealing with questions of pollution and even with questions of the industrial livestock farming. They took up a lot of questions 200 years ago, which are again on the agenda today. Like, for example, that there are too many people living on the planet, or the question if there are too many people living on the planet, or if there are too many people in our country, so therefore we cannot leave refugees into our country, as a lot of politicians in the various countries try to tell us. This has found way into the mainstream media, and some of you might have children or are into films yourself. But there is a famous Marvel movie called Infinity War. And this is dealing with the idea that to raise living standards, give a decent life to everybody, you would just have to eliminate half of the population. So this is the old concept that Malthus came up in the 19th century. And Marx has been arguing against this because Malthus had the idea there is only a limited fertility of the soil. So you can't produce enough food for everybody, so the poor have to starve. That was his logic. And it's the same logic, well, we have to kill half of the people on the planet, then nobody will be poor. This is what some of the rulers want us to believe. But it's not true. Marx explained, on the other hand, it's completely different. He explained about the possibilities of a qualitative increase of fertility based on a change of society, based on a change of the ownership of the productive forces, and therefore the qualitative development of the productive forces. They did not argue, Marx and Engels, they did not argue for an unlimited material growth, so more, but they argued for an unlimited quantitative an increase in quality of production and living standard. They understood that human beings are part of the nature, and they are not, or we are not, like some try to present to us. We are not the crown of creation, like the religions or the bourgeois try to show and say, well, you know, we are better than everybody else, so we can suppress the rest of the nature, we can exploit it. This is rubbish. We are part of it. We are part of it like all the rest of the nature. But unfortunately, I said it's an old idea in the workers' movement, but unfortunately the ideas, the concepts of Marx and Engels were reduced in the workers' movement. They were reduced to a formula, and they were later by social democrats and also Stalinist reformists, and they were actually implementing the bourgeois idea of human beings on top of everything and therefore having the right of exploiting everything. The bourgeois ideas were implemented by reformists into the workers' movement. And today we face quite a similar approach. We are in a battle against an exploitive and eco-unfriendly project, and we often have the experience that it is trade union leaders on the other side, trade union leaders that say, but we need to build this big dam, we need this big plant, we need to get rid of that park and build lots of big houses there, because this will create jobs. So they follow the dogma which is created by capitalist logic that there would be a contradiction between jobs and environment. It is wrong, it is a lie, and it is an instrument to split the labor movement. It's the other way around. Much more and much better jobs could be created in recycling, in environmental friendly, reliable, renewable energy, in rebuilding the nature where it was demolished because of the big crimes of industrial production. The problem we are facing at the moment is that the next capitalist crisis on the horizon, the last is not really over, and the next one is already coming. And this will mean an increased exploitation of human beings and of nature. And therefore, capitalists, in their desperate attempt to look for ways to keep their profits up and to look for places they can invest their capital into, they are going to more and more unsecure ways. This is, for example, the reason why there is increasing gold mines in Turkey and Greece, and of course in lot of other countries. And it's not only very unhealthy and dangerous for nature, it's also horrible jobs. Horrible jobs that the people work in the mines, not only in Turkey and Greece, but all over the world, especially in the neo-colonial countries. So on the one hand, there is of course the need to demand that those mines which are not necessary, which are dangerous, that they should be closed and replaced by something better. But there is also the right of the people who desperately need a job to get a proper, a better, a safer job than they would be in the mines. And this, of course, is also the responsibility of the labor movement to do this. And these new and better and safer jobs could easily be financed with the profits of the big cooperatives. Not only the mining cooperatives that have been stealing for the last decades, or actually centuries, the wealth from people all over the world, but from all the big companies. Just take the figure that most of you will know, that 100 big companies are responsible for 70% of industrial carbon emissions since 1988. So it would be it would be an easy and quick solution to the big problem of carbon emissions if we take these 100 huge companies and change them to renewable energy. It's not a technical problem. The technique for this is there. I cannot explain it to you because I'm not a technician, but people who know much more about this say it's not a technical problem. It's a problem of political will, that the leaders and rulers of capitalism and of the governments, the rulers, they have no interest to change the production of these big 100 companies. So we cannot expect of any bourgeois government or any bourgeois institutions to do this for us. They are not going to do this. They are standing on the other side. But it could be done by the working class people that are rising, that are knowing how production can be changed. They are able to organize the society and the economy along democratic rights. Just imagine how much useless and dangerous production could be abolished if the production would be planned on the basis of what people need and not on the basis of profits. I'll give you one example. I'm from Vienna. It's the capital of Austria, the biggest town in Austria. Every day in Vienna, bread is thrown away because it's not sold, equivalent to what is eaten every day in the second biggest town of Austria, in Graz. It's just thrown away because it's not sold. And this is in the 21st century. What would be easy if for all the data possibilities to, when you go shopping, you have all these cards and all that. It's no problem to know how much bread is needed, approximately, and not every slice, but it could be easily calculated, but it's not done. It's not done. So the capitalist chaos, which is daily existing, leads to overproduction in relation to what people can buy, and it leads to very, very bad quality. We all know these things. We buy it, and then half a year later it's broken, although we know that it's possible to produce a washing machine that can stand for 20 years. But when you buy one now, it's broken after 2 years, because they want to sell it again and again. So the planning of production, of transportation, and of course of the energy sector would be the most effective and would save resources on an enormous scale internationally. It's all linked to capitalism and its crisis. Since the 1970s, we see a policy of privatization, for example, of the energy sector. The big energy companies, alongside the education and the health and the pension system, in a lot of countries, were privatized. They were privatized to give capitalists a possibility to get rid of their over-accumulated capital, to find a new profitable haven to go to. And to what did that lead? This had the effect that there were no new investments done. Like, for example, we see now in the catastrophic role that the Pacific Gas and Electric Company is having in California, where we have the big fires, and they have to close down the whole electricity. Because they didn't have any investments in the last decades. So they're not only not investing in the infrastructure, for sure they do not invest into new renewable energies. If these companies are taken back in public hands to change to renewable energy, this would be a huge step forward. So we would have to renationalize the big industrial companies, and especially the big energy companies. This is not an idea that only socialists have. Even Donald Trump has been thinking about the need to renationalize the energy sector. The Swedish company Vattenfall, which is one of Europe's biggest energy companies, is state-owned. It's state-owned. Of course, if you look at their webpage, they say we are very, very eco-friendly, but it's not true. 40% of the energy production comes from nuclear energy. 25% is from fossils. So this shows that only the question of is it owned privately or is it owned by the state is not enough to answer the problems. But we have to go one step further. We have to make sure that the society and the economy is run by ourselves, by working class people, by the people in the companies, the people in the region, the people from the working class organizations. We have to make sure that we run the economy, because otherwise the enemy is going to ruin it. And we need a democratic planning, not to have competition between the one region and the other region, between the one country and the other country. We need a democratic socialist planning of society. This year, this century, is a time where it would be possible that all people on the planet can live in a good life, where you have dignity for everybody, where there is no suppression and no exploitation, where you have full rights to all genders, to all minorities, and of course to all nationalities. We live in a time where millions of youth go onto the street and battle for their future. I don't know if it is in Turkey, but in Austria we had the problem that politicians were always complaining, oh, the youth, they're also unpolitical, they're not interested in politics. Well, they probably don't say this any longer, but they also completely misunderstood the youth. The youth were not interested in politics. They're just not interested in their corrupt, rotten system. They don't want to participate in this, but they want to fight for their own interests and their own future. There has been in the movement a lot of discussions about how can we go further, how can we win, what can we do? And many have been pointing to individual solutions: become vegan, ride a bike, try to be very eco-friendly. And I think there's nothing wrong on that. It shows the preparedness, the will of people to do something, even to sacrifice for the future. But there is also a French study which was revealed earlier this year, which showed that even if we all would live extremely eco-friendly, it would only solve 1/3 of the problems. So this is not enough. So we have to make clear that we need collective solutions. And the movement of the youth is pointing in this direction. It has an enormous importance to have these discussions in the whole movement, and I think a congress like this is an important step also for these discussions about tactic and strategy on the ground. Democratic structures in the movement are vital to get to the next level. We have seen the huge demonstrations, and I think we're all impressed about 4 million, 6 million people on the street. But size is not everything. The school students have instinctively understood that it's not only enough to demonstrate, but they have to go one step further. They called on to strike. The problem is that school students do not have any economic power. If they don't go to school, it doesn't really give a big problem to the companies. And this is why it needs so desperately to link the struggle of the youth with the struggle of the working class, which is on its rise in so many countries. And this is something that the bourgeois elements in the movements do not like very much. They don't want to link up these struggles. They want to derail the movement, to have some demonstrations, raise some placards, and then go home and be vegan. That's it. But they want us to stay in a safe haven, and this is the reason why democratic discussions inside the movement are so important. It's important to develop a program and a strategy how this struggle can be won. I cannot go into all the proposals and demands that could be raised, but there is a pamphlet outside on sale which is raising a lot of these ideas under the question, under the title 20 questions and answers, how to save the environment. So maybe you're interested into this. It's not enough to have appeals to the institution. It's not enough to be many. We need real steps to get rid of the profit-driven logic of capitalism. It's good that in a number of countries, trade union federations and organizations, shop stewards have been starting to become part of the struggle. This is a step in the right direction. It's not enough yet, especially because the leadership of these unions very often block the protests, but it shows that only the working class has the power in society to change the world. So this might sound a little bit old-fashioned. This is like, in the 19th century we spoke about working class, but now it's more broader, it's all suppressed or whatever. I don't think it is old-fashioned. Look at the struggle of the colleagues in Northern Ireland, in the Irish shipyard of Holland and Wolff. They were in danger of being closed down. A shipyard, which is not the most eco-friendly workplace. They striked. They occupied to defend their jobs. They did not only demand that the plant should be taken over by the state, but they also demanded that the production should be shifted to an eco-friendly production. They also widened the strike. They appealed to other parts of society, to workers in other fields of production. They were in solidarity with the climate strike. They were active and supporting the feminist movement in Ireland. And all these, the combination of a program, of the demands and of the methods, these was the reasons why the colleagues won in Ireland. So they showed in practice that there is no contradiction between environment and the safety of job and of course class issues. I'm coming to an end. It is millions that are going onto the streets on the world wide. It's on all parts of the world. We only have seen very few actually of the huge movements that are going on. The struggles in Chile, in Lebanon, in the US, the struggles in Russia, in China, and in all parts of the world where people are rising not only for climate justice, but also for social justice and for the rights of the suppressed. And these movements start from different points. They do not start from the same analysis, but they come to the same conclusion that it is one system, it's the capitalist system, which is behind all these exploitations and all these problems in society. And therefore it's so important to link these struggles together. The next high point of the movement most likely will be the 29th of November. Again, on a worldwide scale, in a number of countries, millions hopefully will go onto the street. And I think it is the role and the responsibility of socialists, of lefts, of us all to make sure that this struggle links up the struggles of the suppressed masses on this day for social, environmental, women's justice, to bring together all these different parts of the working class in one struggle to win a world, to make it sure that this struggle is won. We have a lot to lose, we have a lot to fight for, but we have a world to win.